Well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today for U of M's Online and Professional Education Leadership and Innovation webinar series. My name is Ann Stevenson, and I'm a program manager for Michigan Engineering Online and Professional Education. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. You're welcome to ask questions throughout the presentation by putting them in the chat or raising your hand via Zoom. And there will also be a dedicated question and answer period following the presentation. So today we're excited to hear from Tony and Elizabeth, whose passion for collaborative learning and improvement is contagious. Let's dive into the session with Tony and Elizabeth as they share their insights and heart for driving positive change. So now I'll turn it over to our speakers. Welcome.
Thanks, Anne, and welcome everybody. It's great to see you here. I share in, I guess, opening this along with Tony and kind of 'tis the season for gratitude. And so I think we always like to open things and just say we're really grateful to be here with you today. My name is Elizabeth. I am both a practitioner and a scholar in the field of organizational change. I am calling in today from New York City, where I live. Where I work with teams and individuals in healthcare to create change and to navigate change and to try to be a little better. And so I am excited to be here today with you to talk about some of the insights, I think, from my work, but also from my work as a scholar. I'm also a PhD student at Holt Ashridge in the UK, where I study action research and what change really looks like on the ground. Luckily, I am joined by my dear friend and colleague today, Tony Benner, who has supported me through change and also has done a lot of work with me. And so I want to give Tony a chance to introduce herself before we get started.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Ann. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me join today in terms of such an important topic, right? Leading change. And so I see some familiar faces too. I'm just going to have a few call outs to Sydney, to Brian, and Hope. We've got some familiar faces here. So again, my name's Tony Benner. I'm one of the instructors who develops and designs custom programs. I teach the Toyota Kata class and two new classes that are up and coming, and one of them is this leading change. So I look forward to Elizabeth, you kind of walking us through and supporting you, and us kind of dancing together and thinking about what does leading change look like in such a dynamic time. And let's kind of share our knowledge and kind of move into this small little tidbit of what we normally do over a 3-day workshop. But let's kind of back to you, and I'll share a little bit about my engineering, my experience in healthcare, and more importantly now in terms of collaboration and coaching. So I'll share more of that as we go through. It's talk about gratitude. Great to be here with supporting you today.
Fantastic. Okay, and so today's topic, as everybody knows, is change. We are working with the assumption that everybody who stepped in the room sees themselves at least a little bit as a change agent. And if you don't in this moment, our hope is that in the next 45 minutes, you will begin to. But regardless of where you sit on that spectrum, when we use the C word, the change word, oftentimes we all get a little bit jittery. I know I do, even though this seems to be the course I've chosen for my life's work. So the first thing we always like to do is set the table and let you know that there is some direction here. There's a method to our madness. What are we going to do over the next 45 minutes? We're going to talk broadly a little bit about leadership, what leadership looks like in today's kind of ever-evolving context. Give you a little bit of a tool and a framework for inviting change, a different way to think about change, maybe not as something that we need to navigate, but something that we can call in. We'll talk a little bit about developing the mindsets for co-creation and how that intersects with change and effective change. And then we'll give you an activity, something to take away, a lot of reflection embedded in our talk today. And so we want you also to kind of sit back. I know this is the middle of the workday for everybody, but make sure that you can find a little bit of that space to do some of that reflection and step back and bring something away for yourself. And then we'll close with some next steps and open some invitations. And so with that, I'm going to give it back to Tony to kick us off and talk a little bit about leadership.
All right, let's do it. So let's actually head over the chat real quick. So can we just make sure either yes or no or something you want to enter into the chat? Make sure you can see the sharing the slides. I know mine kind of disappeared and then kind of came back. So let's just do a little technical check. Can someone or a few people head over to the chat and just kind of express yes, no, or maybe say where you're calling in from. There we go. Okay, I just want to make sure. Perfect. Perfect. Another way to make sure that chat's working too, right? Get that engagement going here. So let's move into it. So this particular slide, I think Elizabeth and I were talking earlier this week. I think it's important to think about leading change and thinking about leadership itself. What does that look like with leadership in the context that you're currently in? What actions are you currently taking? What are your practices of being a leader? And you might not be able to see yourself as a leader potentially right now, but also think about your ecosystem. Think about the people that you work with, even your colleagues. What does that look like in terms of leadership? So I kind of want to set the stage and be able to share my personal experience of when I was coming through manufacturing in the automotive industry and started 2 just-in-time facilities. I had this aha moment, and it was in healthcare that really helped me see leadership and define it a little bit differently. And I love this quote here in terms of, if you want to truly understand something, try to change it. So the invitation that Elizabeth and I are offering is think about changing your leadership for a moment. Think about looking at it from a different perspective. In mine, in terms of when I think about leadership, it's recognizing actually the role of others. And I was always thinking about, I had to go to these training sessions and learn what is the map? What is the blueprint? What are the steps that I need to grow my leadership? And the aha and the pivotal change for me was really about my compass. As a leader, am I oriented to my values? Am I oriented to the organization's purpose? What does that look like to be able to align people to that same purpose? So I think there's a little bit of a shift that we're inviting you to think about in terms of not just the project plan, not just the map of leadership with your team, but very much getting oriented to where you're trying to go. What does that look like in terms of the terrain that you're trying to navigate over? And the fact that leadership is so situational. It is extremely situational. The way that I lead today may be different than tomorrow. The leaders that I work with in terms of this emerging dynamic landscape that we're navigating, it's an ever-changing world. And it invites us to think about leadership and defining it from a different perspective. So I just wanted to share a little bit of my experience where I've had this shift of defining leadership from a little bit different context of thinking about orienting everyone towards a future state. And what does that look like to navigate uncertainty? Now let's kind of toss that back to you now, Elizabeth, in terms of your definition of leadership and taking us a little bit deeper into this.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great way to kick us off, and just to invite everyone to really ground in the realities of uncertainty that in any industry we navigate now. I think a lot of the work Tony and I have done are kind of sit in places where we think, hey, that's complex, right? Like healthcare, right? Very complex. But the reality is that wherever you're standing, the world is complex now. It is ever changing. And so a very central part of what the way we see leadership is that leadership is not separate from, say, change management, but rather being with change and helping others be with change and navigate that and move through that and leverage that is a very central part of what effective leadership is firmly. And so when we stepped back and thought about that, we thought to ourselves, okay, so if we have this sort of abstract, complex image and we think about all the moving parts around us, right? What is it that grounds us as leaders? And, what you'll see on the screen here is an image where we can think about all of these various dots as the ways in an organization that people bring their different strengths forward, right? And so not just that maybe there's a way that we can learn leadership or we teach leadership, but rather how do we develop leadership? How do we develop the qualities within ourselves to be able to use them against or with the qualities in others? And so that's sort of what this image is portraying, not only on this call, but in the greater scheme of things. All of these dots could be filled in with different things. And so when Tony and I stepped back and did a little exercise ourselves, we felt like these 5 things that we have on the screen kind of are central to the way that we see valuable leadership. So the development of self, the use of self, how do we develop that emotional self-awareness? Learning, how do we not only effectively learn, but maintain a learning orientation? How do we stay open to possibilities? Relationships, how do we move in a way that we construct effective relationships, that we create meaning in relationships such that they cast forward? Purpose. Tony talked a little bit about the compass. Where do we find direction? What's pulling us? And probably our favorite is try. And we like to use that very simple word for what we mean by having a very experimental mindset, being willing to step into uncertainty, to create the space for that learning, to leverage the people around us to be able to do that. And so what we want to do now is start to think about what these other dots might look like along with all of you, because we know that we're in a diverse group of people right here. All of you in some context that take a leadership role, whether you have people that report to you or you don't, in some dynamic, you may act as a leader. And so what we want you to do is just take a couple minutes. Maybe you have a piece of paper, maybe you have a Word document open, and reflect on what leadership means to you. So if you were to think about what are the top 3 or 5 things that characterize your leadership, that you want to sort of put into this grid, that you would use as your strengths, what is it that you would write down? And if you are struggling to see yourself right now as a leader, maybe think about who's a leader that you've looked to in your career, or in just in life, right? Who's somebody that you look up to, and how would you describe those things? Let's take maybe 2 minutes. Tony, did you have something to add?
Yeah, the exercise is making me reflect on just recently being in the operating room. I was doing some shadowing and working with some of the clinical team. And one of the things in my observation, I was always playing with this question about who are you as a leader? I entered the space as a leader, and I'm thinking about who am I in this moment in the operating room as a leader? And then I'm looking around and watching who else are exhibiting leadership behaviors. What does that look like in terms of the action? So the way that I would answer in chat right now, and I apologize, I won't be able to type this in right now, but the chat, what I would also was like, wow, I was amazed to watch the team really do some active listening. And so for me, leadership and part of that definition is around active listening that I observed here recently in the operating room. So just as an example. Anyone else have anything they would add in terms of who are you as a leader? What are some of those elements? Do you have another example, Elizabeth, that you would share?
Yeah, I think even just I think sort of the intersection of communication and relationships is really critical. And so having a sensitivity to who's in the room, how do we interact with those people as individuals, and how do we serve as sort of a catalyst for other interactions, and how do we, help others communicate effectively and be able to share their ideas. Anybody else? Anybody have anything they want to throw in the chat? Anything they want to contribute to the image? You just never know. We've done this talk several times. Maybe it'll make it into the next round.
For me, leadership is thinking about people that I admire and that I would like to follow. Is someone that listens with attention to others, and then they have empathy and understand what the person wants to say and what they need. And also something that I admire from good leaders is that they are honest and you can trust them.
Excellent, Janet. Thank you.
Nice. Thank you, Janet.
We got a few other chat. I don't know if you can see Elizabeth in terms of Linda putting in compassion. Talk about the one of the true North Stars there, right? In that network is compassion. What does that look like in well-being and courage?
Yeah.
And Trisha has really listening, right? Bethany's putting in transparency. When you think about this network, think about the contagion that we bring in leadership in terms of how they influence us and what that looks like, and how our energy, again, this network and this image, what that looks like at connecting dots, transparency.
Yeah, I think, when I hear the compassion piece is so interesting to reflect on when I think about observing really strong leaders. It sometimes isn't just that I perceive them as compassionate to me. It's that they're so compassionate, so kind, that I have the opportunity to observe what that looks like in an interaction with someone else. And I think that's also a really powerful thing that can subtly develop someone else when you get to see it so apparently. So yeah, really good ads. Anything else? I actually can't see the chat, so.
Take initiative. And You know, one of the things too, and I know just with time, we've got a few things here scrolling: transparency, trustworthiness, caring, people first mindset, you know, and if we look at kind of summarizing all of these that we're putting into the chat and our personal reflections, it's interesting to think about developing leadership. And if you think about these elements that are so important to us, it takes time, it takes practice. So leadership is also, when we talk about leading change, what does that look like in terms of longitudinal, being able to put practices in place? How do I practice with compassion and bringing that into observation and my practice? Transparency. So just a way to kind of bring that together in terms of all of these elements, Elizabeth, that you can't see. It is very much those soft skills. What is it to be able to be really human and think about people first mindset? And I think that's leading us right into where you're going to with the next piece with leadership and diversity. Decision making is another one that just came up.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, so really starting to fill that in and starting to see where, just on this call around leadership, both in what we think and probably who we are, we have lots of diversity of thought. And so, you know, one of the things that Tony and I always like to talk about is the value of diversity of thought. Oftentimes in an organization and sometimes from a leadership perspective, especially when we're under the gun, we perceive diversity of thought as something that we need to navigate. But we continuously try to take the mindset of diversity of thought is really something to be leveraged, and how do we empower that and bring it alive so that we can have sort of a more complex environment, a more almost a richer field from which to work. And so what really is diversity of thought? And so on the image here, we see all of these different colored figures, and we see the figure in the center that everybody's kind of looking in on and seeing just a little bit differently. But if we didn't bring those voices alive, we may not know that everybody's seeing that a little bit differently. And we may not know all of the possible ways that we could see that, which represent also possible ways that actually we can move things forward, that we could think differently, that we can relate to things differently. And so, you know, Tony's talking about the practices of leadership. And so there's sort of these levels of, okay, what's our idea of good? And then what is the practice that puts that into action, that brings these things out, that allows us to use them? Tony, what would you add here?
This slide's reminding me of a conversation I just had with Sydney, actually. We're talking about diversity of thought. We're talking about leadership in the different lens. So the invitation here is also to think about, from all these different perspectives, how do you lead? How do you bring the diversity into the room? How do you bring it into the collective? How do you hold space for that? And then think about honoring it. It's not trying to commonize or to standardize everybody's thought, but really thinking about, wow, the more diversity we have, the more exponential return we're going to have in terms of improving our process, our collaboration. What does that look like in terms of our key performance indicators? Right here is the heartbeat of really honoring and thinking about, as a leader, thinking about change, what is diversity of thought? So I love the way that you're bringing this in and naming it and thinking about, okay, how do we surface it? How do we have conversations in our meetings and our huddles to look at these different perspectives of change and honor the different thinking around it? And so I remember actually just having the conversation with Sydney earlier and thinking about, wow, this is simple but challenging, right? Exactly. Linda put in the chat, this is brilliant. When we think about appreciative inquiry, being curious and vocalizing question invites people to realize their contributions are welcome. This is so key to appreciative inquiry. This is so key in terms of bringing the collective and creating that space to be able to put voice, right? What does that look like? So I know I can go off on a tangent on this one too. And this is, I know, a whole nother workshop that we end up doing. So I'll bring it back to you, Elizabeth, in terms of taking us and maybe bringing in just a moment around Linda's point about appreciative inquiry and your experience. I know you've had quite a bit of experience with appreciative inquiry.
Yeah. So, appreciative inquiry, for anybody that doesn't know, is a large scale change method. It's based in the principles of positive psychology, but also firmly in the idea that the questions that we ask create the worlds that we live in. And so kind of the nuanced way that we frame those questions, that we interact around those questions, and how that almost organically enables change, right? Those sort of micro moments that can occur in those environments that then can exponentially change the conditions that we live in. And so I actually want to go to the next slide on this because I think the point you're making, Tony, is really interesting. So when we think about diversity of thought, the reality is that, we opened this and we talked about kind of the fast-paced changing world that we live in. And then we said to you, but value diversity of thought and bring more in, right? And so exactly what Tony just said, I can get down a rabbit hole about this. I can, have a whole nother workshop, right? So quickly we begin to become sort of overwhelmed when we actually have too many ideas in the room. And so one of the sort of critical pieces of valuing diversity of thought is not holding thought to ourselves, but rather it's sharing thought with others to be able to widen the perspective of the collective. And so, one of the things that I like to think about both in my practice and in my research is that there sort of is always a territory that we're playing in, right? Maybe in an organization, maybe that's a department, maybe it's a unit, maybe it's a team, maybe it's a one-on-one interaction. And in any of those spaces, we can have lots of ideas to the point that we can kind of become saturated. But when we step back on those, we realize that what we're actually doing is really only seeing things through actually a very small, almost like a flashlight, right? We're just pointing a flashlight. We're actually only seeing just what we can see. And that the purpose of those interactions is actually to broaden the perspective of that flashlight, to shine a little bit light on a little bit more. And so when we think about diversity of thought, it's not just the idea of an individual valuing diversity of thought. It's how do we engage others to also value diversity of thought so that we can broaden that perspective together. Tony, what else would you add here?
I'm going to bring in some of our real world examples together. Recently, over the last few years, we did a merger and acquisition, right? When we talk about really widening the perspective, how is it that you're bringing that particular team who's merging with another organization in terms of widening the view? And I'll land and converge on two things. Think about this as your leadership, meaning how is it that you're making sense of the current situation and how are you giving sense? How are you helping people see things in terms of widening the perspective and then also converging down to making it very actionable? And as I mentioned that, Linda put in the chat also, thanks for the contribution here, Linda. I really appreciate it. It's helping us even think through and widening our perspective of leading change. And she mentions that calling it a landscape, right? Thinking about mapping territory is a powerful distinction within this analogy. What does that look like to always be able to think about where am I going, but where am I taking that next step? And Elizabeth is the master of thinking about try and just trying your next step. What does that look like? She reminds me all the time to look wide, but what does that look like? And I think that's a real skill when we think about leading change. How is it that I'm comfortable with the micro step that I'm ready to take, but yet the step person next to me may be ready to take the bigger leap, right? What does that look like to connect and advance both ourselves and others as we're in a relationship? This is the reminder to me that leadership and leading change is a team sport. And I know we go much deeper into this in the workshop in terms of practicing, doing role modeling and experimenting with this, but let's bring it back to where you want to take us next, Elizabeth.
Yeah, so thanks for that. All right, so as always, we've gotten a little bit abstract here. I think we've actually invited you into the space where change starts to happen. And sometimes this is what it can feel like. Lots of ideas, lots of possibilities. And we have sort of a decision point now, right? Do those possibilities make us shy away from the next step, or do those possibilities invite us to step in? And so one of the things that Tony and I like to use when we're in an organization, in a community, working with a group, kind of when we start to see this point coming, right, is we say, okay, let's step back a little bit and use a little bit of a framework just to feel where we are. And so one of the things that we like to use is called the change equation. It's from Beckert and Harris. It dates all the way back to the 80s. I don't know if anyone on this call was even born then, but before all of our time. So the change equation. The change equation tells us that change happens when we have dissatisfaction with the status quo. Right? What's happening right now, we're not so happy. When we have a vision of the future, right? A vision, something that's kind of outside of what we know we can do right now in the immediate, right? Sometimes we get a little confused about what a vision is, right? Something that's kind of bigger than us. And when we have an idea of those first steps and we're willing to maybe move 1 foot forward. And when we multiply those things together, they have the opportunity to overcome resistance. And so resistance in a system, especially in a social system, is sort of an ever-present force. And so we are never going to actually get rid of all the resistance. Oftentimes in organizations, what we want to do is let's reduce resistance, let's have a party, let's have a kickoff, let's have balloons. All of those things are fine and great. The reality is what those things do is not eliminate resistance, right? The resistance is still there. What we're trying to do is actually create other factors that can overpower the resistance to move us 1 foot forward. And so when Tony and I think about this, we like to think about it actually less so in an equation, but more so in a recipe. Like we've got a big pot of soup or something, and we're saying, sprinkle a little of this, sprinkle a little of that. Let's make sure everything's alive, and then let's move it forward. Because in the equation, these factors are actually multiplied by one another. And so one of the really critical pieces is the fact that it can be great if we have dissatisfaction, which we know we often do. And if we have some first steps, sometimes we do, right? We love action items, but maybe we don't really have a strong vision. And so when our vision becomes a 0, we multiply these things together, we actually have nothing, right? And that resistance can overcome what we're trying to do. And so how do we keep all 3 of those things alive to be able to move things forward effectively, and also to be able to grasp on what currently is, right? To be able to kind of sway the system rather than force it forward. Tony, what did I miss here?
Miss anything. I just would like to reinforce the fact of the multiplier. When we're talking about appreciative inquiry, when we're talking about change at a large scale, we really honor the exponential change. And so one reason I think that you and I both kind of play with the change equation, the one that we're looking at here, is when we go in and work with teams is, can they name their dissatisfaction? What does that look like? What does it look like from the diversity of perspective? Somebody may be satisfied, somebody may be dissatisfied. So how as a leader are you going to navigate that? Somebody has a different vision of what could be in that future. And then the same thing in terms of, do you have clarity on that first next step? And as a leader, one of the things that we're talking about is yourself as an agent for change. This is what it comes down to. This is what we talk about in terms of leading change. How is it that you're going to take your first steps to potentially try something different as a leader? Do you have clarity on what that might look like? Do you have a coach? Do you have a colleague that you can work with? So I think it's really important to just hold here for a minute and think about, as a leader, do I understand what change looks like? And always honoring the fact that resistance is always going to be there. Can you name that? Can you appreciate the awareness of it? How do you manage it? And I think the multiplier, as you mentioned, is really important to think about the exponential return. And I think that's the essence of when we talk about leading change, we kind of play in that space, right? We think about not just where we move in terms of incremental, but that multiplier. So I just wanted to kind of shine a light and highlight, if you will, on the equation, the actual multiplier itself. And think about, what does that mean as a leader? And I love the way that you put recipe around this. I think it's so key, where for me as an engineer, I'm thinking logically, it's like, it's always got to be step 1, 2, 3, 4. If we can come up with those fundamental recipe elements, and then as a leader, can we see the situational part of it? Can we adapt? Can we really be able to move through this dynamic landscape and think about those? And you and I always joke around about the chocolate chip cookie, right? So I want more chocolate chips. Do I want to be crunchy? Do I want them to be chewy? What does that look like if it's a dunker? So I know I'm kind of going off on the chocolate chip cookie thing, but this brings it back to, how are you working together with as a team? And I know I'm going to call out Brian here for a minute too, in terms of some of the team members that he's worked with, and how do you kind of roll this out at scale? You've got a fundamental recipe, and he beautifully says, okay, here's what it means for us and our team. And he rewrote the script a little bit. And I'm just inviting you to think about, what's the fundamental, try it as a leader, and think about what elements can you kind of tweak a little bit based on where you're trying to go in the vision. So I know I kind of went into a deeper dive here, but
No, it's great. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about how that overlays into kind of the dynamic landscapes that we find ourselves in.
yeah, and I know I'm watching our time here too. So one of the things when we think about, in the very beginning, I talked about this light bulb. So my background, electrical engineer, I kind of always resonate with the light bulb. Can you imagine right now in the scenario, we're all sitting around and we still have candlelight? And what would we be communicating? And think about how many people weren't adapting and embracing the light bulb. And think about now, when we think about change and innovation as a leader, how do you take that resistance and move it forward into possibilities? And so when I'm thinking about possibilities, you're going to have the people that resist. You're going to have the people that are ready to go, that are ready, already halfway up the mountain, didn't realize the other side of that's going to be a cliff. This is pulling all of the people together in this dynamic landscape. And what does that look like? And I think now we're coming out of COVID also, we think about, we've pushed the edge of what are the things that we're doing to just fix things, as opposed to what are we doing to really be innovative in that space. And I think, Elizabeth, a lot of your work too in healthcare, where it's really thinking about innovation and what does that technology look like, and looking at things from just a different perspective, and not just the traditional continuous improvement and lean methodologies, but really pulling together organization development and design. And that requires us to think about ourselves in a different perspective.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think this is like actually really critical. I mean, I've seen just in my career alone, like sort of the shift towards actually wanting to fix problems. And I think in improvement science and that line of work, I think there's, you know, oftentimes that's what we think of ourselves. I've been in many engagements actually where I've walked in and somebody said, she's here to solve your problems. She's here to fix things for you. And to an extent, that's true, right? When we play in this space, right, you want to get good at your work, and you want to be the person that can come in and say, hey, here's a good idea, maybe you could do this, right? But most effectively, I think I've actually been able to harness the other side. And so when I kind of put my efforts on helping a team cast their vision forward, you know, really, how do you write those goals? Where do you want to go? It's amazing to see actually how people just organically fix problems, right? Because all you're doing is building context. And that's really so much of what change is about, is how can you create the container, the frame for people to have a little bit more context, to be able to learn for themselves, and to be able to take those next steps in a safe way. And that's really powerful when we as change practitioners can shift our mindset to think about possibilities rather than fixing problems. Okay. Should we go into another quick activity? Tony, you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I want to add real quick. Linda made a really good comment too in the chat, and I know you can't see that, so I just want to pause here for a minute in terms of appreciating the change model. And I think it ties beautifully to the slide and where you're taking us with mindsets, right? When we think about finding the ability, and I don't know if Linda, if you want to actually speak to this yourself, please unmute and jump right in. This is, you know, find the ability to identify what's off and needing adjustment to be one of the hardest parts. This is the space that we're talking about, the change equation, and thinking about the mindset, right? Am I trying to fix a problem that doesn't need to be fixed? Or am I thinking about possibilities that are going to take us exponentially into another place? This is simple yet extremely challenging. It's hard to be able to get yourself into this mindset. It's hard to be able to get your colleagues into this mindset. But the possibilities and thinking about imagining what could be, people are complainers. They want to just keep talking about, here's what needs to be fixed. It's lacking action. As a leading change, thinking about yourself as an agent for change and what that looks like to bring action to the table. And we start a lot of times when we think about the mindsets for change. What are the possibilities? And I love this quote. I'll just use this one quote and you can move us into that next activity here, right? In the beginner's mind, there's so many possibilities because we don't know what we don't know. The experts, there are few. What it's inviting us to think about is, how do we have a practice of unlearning? How do we check ourselves in terms of what we think is true and what we know, as opposed to what could be? And that's an example of our mindsets in terms of fixtures on the manufacturing floor, or what does that look like in the emergency room, and setting up a different flow in terms of triaging. So just some examples of it takes a different mindset to think about bringing the change equation into practice. And I know you're going to take us into a little bit of an example there. I kind of jumped the gun with my two examples, but back to you.
No, it's great. Thank you. Yeah, and so keeping with this and kind of keeping with the messaging, I think sometimes when we start to frame things as, you know, we're talking about inviting possibilities and not fixing problems, it can seem very binary, right? This is good and this is bad, move away from this. But really the messaging here is around how complex things are, right? All of these things live all the time, just like resistance always lives. And it's about, how do we shine the light on where do we want to go, and not just on what we want to fix. And so thinking about that, you know, one of the other things that comes to mind is that a lot of this doesn't just happen in individual interactions and, you know, just these single moments that appear. Much of it happens because over a bit of time, we build the conditions that enable these things to come alive. Like Tony said, you know, taking on these mindsets for ourselves is very, very challenging. Certainly helping someone else take on that mindset can be even more challenging. And so as leaders, that's kind of what we're tasked to do, right? Is how do we see ourselves and how do we see the way we're thinking? And how do we then actualize that to be able to influence others? And so when we think about the conditions for change, certainly we can borrow from the change equation. You know, we want these elements to be present, that we have some shared dissatisfaction, vision, first steps, and that we have some awareness maybe to our resistance. But what we wanted you to do today is also to take a step back and gain a little bit of awareness to when you think about change, and we have the image on the screen of the sailboat. And so the change that we're trying to affect here is sailing this boat, right? Maybe sailing it into a lovely sunset, maybe like a glass of champagne or two. And so the way that we're gonna think about this is when we think about the boat, maybe underneath the boat, there's an anchor. And that might be what's keeping us in place when we think about organizations as systems and how these things interact. We can think about one of the most effective ways actually to create change is to think about, what am I doing to stay the same? Right? And that's often what our anchor is. That's what keeps us there. At the top, we have the sails. Those are the things that are going to cast us forward, the conditions that are going to enable change, the conditions that are going to enable us to move, even if it's just a bit, to catch that momentum. And so first, we want you to step back and think about what's in that anchor. What are the conditions that keep us anchored, that keep us stuck? What does that look like? What does it feel like? What are the behaviors? What comes up for you when you think about that? It could be something really broad. It could be something very specific example. And we know this is being recorded. And so certainly open to having people throw things in the chat. But if you're not comfortable with that, certainly just take a few minutes and think about that. Maybe take a Post-it and write down a couple ideas for yourself.
Yeah, being overly busy, not having enough downtime to reflect.
Mm-hmm.
This is a great opportunity. The activity that Elizabeth's walking us through is a reflection. I want you to think about your current environment. I want you to think about what's going on for yourself. Think about what's going on for your team members. Think about the environment that you work in or that you're sitting in right now, and think about what's holding back change. What can you name some of those resistant pieces? And I'll use an example right now. I'm actually just looking outside the window and it is snowing like crazy. And I'm resistant because I want the sunshine. So I'm like afraid of what's coming up in the next 2 months. So my fear of like, oh no, change is being forced upon me.
Yep.
What else do you have? What else can put maybe a few more things in the chat or unmute and share? What are some of the things? What are the anchors in terms of your yourself, your team, your condition, your organization?
I love the example of overly busy. I had a leader recently share with me that when she came into the organization, she was really motivated, and she was like, I had all these ideas and I came in and I was like gung-ho, we're going to do this thing. And she's like, but then nobody really wanted to do it. And so, you know, I just stopped. It dissolves. And so, you know, really what that is you become overly busy. You become like other things become your priority. And it's not that change isn't your priority. It's that those ideas, the vision of what could be, starts to get lost, right? And so how do you keep that time to be able to step back, to know what's important, and to be able to take those sort of micro actions in that direction rather than letting it literally drown you with the anchor? What else do we have in the chat? Anything?
Yeah, we have uncertainty for the future, fear for the future. And then another one just added was resistance from others who don't want to work. Work has become unattractive to many people. This is so big when we think about our work and how it's changed, the work effort itself, the work itself, and what does that look like in a hybrid environment? What does that look like collaborating? Right now, we're all in these Zoom boxes. It's like the blessing of being able to bring us all together over distance. And at the same time, we've distanced and created space between our head, heart, and hands. Huge part of resistance in terms of wanting to be able to do the work, engage in the work. What does that look and feel like in your environment, right? Just that's a really big one to be able to name. And just for the sake of time here too. So when we talk about a person of inquiry, this is my learning too, as an engineering piece where I'm always trying to solve problems. And now that I've learned to kind of put that in the parking lot, to name the resistance, name the problem, think about now moving your team into what are the conditions that enable change, right? Elizabeth, do you want to walk us through into kind of shifting now our mindset from not just naming the anchors, but what does that look like in terms of facing the future and opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we think about looking forward and kind of what are the conditions that support effective change and growth, really, right? And so growth has sort of an effect that happens over time, right? We don't just mean something that's in the day to day. I'm going to use another example actually to describe this. I have a leader that I've been working with for close to a year, and her and her team have been working on process improvement efforts, and I've been coaching her. And one of the really critical things that we have put in place is simply consistency, right? And so she started to understand kind of how her behaviors were affecting her team. How does she interact with her team? How does she ask questions? How does she listen? How does she take those little things forward to show her team, hey, we're working on this. And so somebody brought up this idea that people don't like work anymore, and I couldn't agree with that more. But I will tell you that yesterday I was on a call with this team, and the leader invited one of her team members into a meeting, and her team member said to her, "Wow, thank you for that." And I thought to myself, wow, that's such a different attitude, right? Than somebody's grateful for the opportunity to go to a new meeting, to be seen, right? That's kind of, they're seeing that as an opportunity for development. And it's a real example of what happens when we create the conditions where people can see that change is possible. And so now let's think a little bit about when those sails are blowing, right? What are the conditions that enable us to move forward? That enable us to kind of feel the wind in our hair, if you will.
Your grandfather also used to always coach me to say, you're the captain of your ship. So right now, if you had choice in terms of vision of what could be, what are the things that help enable a first step? Can we just name a few as we kind of wrap up our time together in the webinar? And again, I know in our workshop, we spend a lot more time on this, but what does that look like to just put yourself for a moment? What are the enablers? What are the things that light you up? What are the things that help move forward? What does that look like for your team to be able to feel your energy? When we talk about leading change, we've got the project plan, we've got change management. We're inviting you to think about actually the things to layer on top of that, right? Think about things in terms of what does that really look like to create a contagion for people to come together and step into that space. Linda mentions also physical movement, right? Can help get out of the overthinking in my head, more ideas. Our workshop, we do that actually. Everyone get up, move around. What does that look like? That whole somatic piece of it. And I know, Elizabeth, you do a lot of that with your teams too, in terms of movement.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and some of that is also about, just like we're saying, how do you just shift your perspective a little bit, right? As soon as you come back to that, it looks a little bit different. You might be able to see possibilities that you couldn't see before. And how do you feel movement? How do you feel that motion that could be in a lot of things? What else we have? Anything? Anybody want to come off mute?
I think we've got a quite group today. Everyone's still in the snow. No, I'll kind of bring us forward here too. When you think about when you change what you think changes, right? So this is the whole point, I guess, of the activity. What we're trying to model for you here over the last 45 minutes, or what questions are you asking of your team? What questions are you asking of yourselves? And when you start really thinking about those type of skills as a leadership, it brings you into this space of thinking about our thinking being different and changing just the thinking itself, our behaviors, our mindsets. And I'll leave you one other thing as before you kind of close this out here, Elizabeth, too, is when we think about the types of behaviors as leadership, I encourage you to think about, what does that look like to be supportive? What does that look like to have a strong orientation towards results? What does that look like to seek different perspectives? Seeking as the key word. As a leader, how are you seeking? And then how do you solve problems in a more effective way? What does that look like to really think about decision making and bring that into our critical thinking? So just some of those elements and behaviors of leadership that I know we go into a deeper dive about that, but when those all come into place, what does that look and feel like, Elizabeth? You want to kind of bring us home with that?
Yeah, definitely. I love that you brought up the when we change what we think, things change. And I think it's a nice segue into this last slide that is kind of all about that, and the idea that there's lots of different dimensions to all of the different ways and things that we can think. And so that's very, very central to the workshop that Tony's talking about, the 3-day leading change workshop, where we delve a little bit deeper into some of those different constructs, and not just in a way that that we're teaching you how to do that, but rather how is it that you're currently thinking, and where is it that you can shift a little bit, right? And so what we have on the slide is just some of those ideas, more broad ideas of kind of the interactions and relationships of pieces of that. And sometimes when we step away from this, we feel like a lot of what we talk about is very social, but the reality of organizational change is that it does sit in a socio-technical space. And so we also want to show you that some of that is married into technical perspectives and how those things relate. We just have a little bit of a different perspective on those. And so hopefully we'll be able to see some of you in that leading change workshop in 2025. And we'd love to go a little bit deeper into these ideas. Yeah, and to close us out, I think somebody said in the chat that oftentimes one of the things that prevents change is that we don't have the time to step back and reflect. And so one of the things Tony and I like to be really mindful of is our own ability to stay grounded in these complex environments. And this quote is something that keeps us grounded together. Coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, working together is success. And so we offer it to you here as both a reminder of this workshop and a reminder that there are others out there navigating these complex environments, and you are never alone. You are only one step away from finding someone who can broaden your perspective and help you take those first steps. So thank you, Tony. Is there anything else you wanted to throw in before we take maybe any questions?
Yeah, I'll just kind of wrap up a little bit too with these whole sunflowers, right? And there's a metaphor here in terms of how can we unlock our own potential for change? What does that look like to help others unlock their potential for change? And really think about enabling the mindsets and the behaviors, and what does that look like in terms of the leadership skills that are kind of underneath the water, if you will, in terms of coming together. And I'll just close also. I believe leadership is a team sport, and I appreciate collaborating with you, Elizabeth, and always again with Anne and the team too, in terms of being able to share a little bit of, it's like the elevator speech here in terms of sharing a little bit of what does that mean in terms of being a leader. Hopefully you've taken one thing away. How does that look like looking at change from a different perspective too? And thank you for joining us and spending time with us today. And yeah, if we have any questions, let's kind of move into that space.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tony and Elizabeth. So if you, again, like Tony just said, if you have any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat, or, I mean, it sounds like we could also, you could just unmute and ask as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is Linda. I just wanted to thank you all so much. And at one point you were asking when I was saying how challenging it is to identify, the dissatisfaction, much less like the solution to it. I was referencing the work that I do in community development and community-based settings, particularly in a deindustrialized town that has so many competing priorities. And so it just feels like, me trying to kind of boil the ocean, if you will. Like, I feel like my head is spinning all the time, and I'm just like, how can we improve this? And I think I guess I'm just kind of observing out loud, and if you have any thoughts, I would appreciate it. I would love to be able to implement a collective impact approach here, but there's so much resistance across things like educational levels, generations, incomes, race, and then just there's actually a lot of like a concentration of health issues here. And so I've been thinking, you know, because there's so much tension and so many issues, focusing on wellness is can be one of those things that's like laying the groundwork and helping, at least it helps me stay grounded, and I think demonstrating it helps others. Yeah, like I said, I don't know what my question is, but if you have any thoughts or any ideas for navigating through competing priorities, that would be great.
Yeah, I think thanks for that. Actually, that's a really good, it's almost a really good dose of reality, right? That's what this stuff really looks like in real life. And I think it actually goes back to the idea that we were first talking about, that like as a leader affecting change, it really does begin with you. Because oftentimes when you're the person standing in that, you are the person that can see the most, right? You're suddenly feeling actually the burden of, wow, there's so many problems, there's so many things, like where do I begin? You also have now the advantage of thinking a little bit differently about, you use the word collective impact. And so how is it that you are going to develop that collective, and around what? And it doesn't always mean that it has to be constructed of exactly what are everyone's complaints, but you may have the opportunity to see how those complaints interact. How do they create a greater vision? And how do you bring different sets of people maybe together to be able to grow different ideas? Tony, what would you add there?
I so appreciated the words that you chose to use to represent this. One, you said we, I don't know how many times in your definition and just in terms of sharing with us. And it is a we, right? So when then you said, what is it that I can do? And so I love where Elizabeth's taking us and thinking about the collective. Appreciative inquiry is so powerful when you think about using that wellness, like you're saying, as a North Star. People will resonate towards that. But what's that one first step of being able to say, what does wellness look like? What does that mean for you? And being able to model that. So I just still kind of hang on the appreciative inquiry model in terms of your words matter. What does that look like in terms of starting with a smaller scale and being able to really define, communicate what wellness looks like so that people can rally around that? So just kind of reinforcing the model that we're talking about is appreciative inquiry to answer, I think, some of your questions and coach you into the next steps.
Those are all very helpful. Thank you.
Certainly.
Thank
Good
you.
luck. Let us know how it goes and what your next steps are.
I will. Yeah, it's interesting because what you're saying really is affirming to where I've been heading. And I think for me, I love that you mentioned the small scale, because I've been in situations where I couldn't follow through because of a number of circumstances, and it felt terrible. And I'm like, I need to approach this at the smallest possible scale so that I can continue to follow through. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at now, is like how to. And another thing is infusing humor. I'm actually wanting to start doing stand-up as a hobby, because it's a kind of like part of my family. And I'm like, you know what, this is a skill I want to build, and I think it'll help me with other things. So yeah.
It's a great example. We just had the Women in Leadership last month, and Heidi actually kicked off with improv, our opening keynote, and it was amazing to see all of the women at the leadership conference really rally around the whole humor and improv part of it. I mean, the energy just kind of the whole room kind of lifted up. So great perspective in terms of bringing humor. It's again seeing people in terms of who they are and being human about it. I mean, that's the part of kind of unconstructing the process improvement and change into what is it that humans, what do we need? What brings us together? So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So I know we're getting ready to wrap up here. And if there's any other questions, please put them in the chat, or if again, reach out to us, and we're always make sure we're available, and always love talking about leading change.
Yeah, here's our contacts. Please do be in touch. Linda, I would love to hear where all that goes. And of course, you know, part of our message is also that we firmly believe we're all in this together. And so if there's things that we can support anyone in, please feel free to reach out. We've dropped a lot of things on this webinar today. If you have further questions, we'd love to be in touch.
All right, with that.
All right, well, thank you so much for everyone for joining us, and thank you to Elizabeth and Tony for such great insights. We hope to see you at future webinars. And with that, have a great day, and I'm looking out at the snow, and you know, stay warm and stay safe.